Imagine looking down on an unassailable stronghold with its cannons gleaming from cliffs that threaten to bend the Mississippi itself. By 1863, Vicksburg, the Confederate Gibraltar of the West, had destroyed all Union generals who opposed it. Ulysses S. Grant, however, was no ordinary general. He was an innovator and a daring tactician who transformed failure into fuel and river mud into a route to immortality. Which perverse engineering plans did he initiate? Just to see them go under the water? How did he execute the most daring river crossing in Civil War history while simultaneously outwitting two Confederate armies and marching his men into what detractors referred to as a death trap? And why, just before he permanently altered the rules of war, did his own officers implore him to withdraw? Hold on tight as we break down 5 brutal strategies that did more than simply breach Vicksburg's walls. They broke the backbone of the Confederacy. You'll understand why one historian dubbed this campaign, "Grant's masterwork is a symphony of nerve, ingenuity, and anarchy." To help our community, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel before we start. The Union faced many difficulties in their attempt to seize Vicksburg. An unsuccessful naval attack in May 1862 failed to overrun Confederate gun batteries, marking the start of the initial operations. As winter drew near, General Ulysses S. Grant was appointed to lead operations after further summer offensives failed to establish strategic superiority. Engineers started a large-scale river diversion project during this time by building canals next to the city. The goal of this hydrological engineering project was to get around Vicksburg's strong defenses. By changing the Mississippi's path, modern military strategists hypothesized that this kind of river realignment may lessen the city's tactical importance. But because of the severe summer temperatures that rendered many laborers unable to work and the prevalence of tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery, the effort stalled too soon. Under President Lincoln's close supervision, and with daily progress updates required by the White House, Grant resumed excavating in January. Grant acknowledged the canal's secondary advantages for preserving soldier discipline and physical conditioning in advance of spring maneuvers, despite his own doubts about its feasibility. 5 more military attempts between January and March 1863, including a naval invasion into the Yazoo River, all failed to get close to Vicksburg's perimeter. These unsuccessful attempts were later described by Grant as tactical reconnaissance missions that mainly showed Vicksburg's impenetrable defenses. Unexpected river surges broke through containment structures during the tough March Canal digging, flooding the completed channel. Confederate artillery spotters on the bluffs promptly targeted the steam-powered dredging craft that Union engineers had placed to clear the waterway with precise bombardments. This last setback forced hydraulic engineering solutions to be completely abandoned. Grant made a drastic strategy change in response to dwindling options, approving a full-scale invasion of the planet from the east. Grant needed to get behind Confederate positions in order to carry out his eastern flanking assault against Vicksburg. His troops marched south along the western bank of the Mississippi in search of feasible river passage locations. However, naval backup was needed for the crucial crossing in this mission. The squadron of Rear Admiral David D. Porter was crucial. Porter carried off a risky nighttime maneuver of his armored flotilla past Vicksburg's defenses on April 16th, while under constant artillery fire. The United forces redeployed downstream to Bruinsburg after their initial amphibious attempts at Grand Gulf proved unsustainable. Grant successfully crossed the river at this point on April 30th, signaling his entry into Confederate-held Mississippi. The Army now relied on carrying provisions, albeit this was dependent on securing future supply channels. Grant's unwavering determination throughout this dangerous time is highlighted in historical chronicles. Previous operational experience was the source of this confidence. Damaged supply lines during previous ground operations against Vicksburg had forced soldiers to effectively forage for agricultural products. Grant therefore postulated that if needed, his men could temporarily support themselves through requisitioning. Complete supply line desertion never happened, despite what the media often claims. Historical ambiguity was introduced by Grant's subsequent writings that alluded to a logistical split on May 3rd. Only a 72-hour provisioning gap between the Bruinsburg crossing and Grand Gulf seizure on May 3rd is confirmed by archival documents. Grant put in place a creative resupply strategy once Grand Gulf was taken. Through the floodplain, wagons loaded with ammunition and hardtack were sent along a dark riverbank path. General Sherman and other critics cautioned that this poor route could never support 50,000 men and called for an operational halt to consolidate supplies. Grant's hybrid provisioning approach was made clear by his written rejoinder. Although complete rationing over the Grand Gulf is unlikely, we will use local procurement to augment transported staples. Coffee and breadstuffs will maintain combat preparedness until complete logistics are restored. The campaign's result was ultimately determined by this calculated risk, which confirmed Grant's operational flexibility. Grant followed a meticulous operating plan, although Vicksburg remained the campaign's major goal. Because Port Gibson controlled the regional transportation routes that connected Grand Gulf to Jackson, it became his first objective in Mississippi. Control of the Southern Railroad, Vicksburg's crucial supply route, would be given to Union forces if this nexus were secured. Confederate Major General J.S. Bowen inferred Grant's plans to cross the Mississippi after the Grand Gulf reverses and forecasted the targeting of Port Gibson. By using Colonel Benjamin Grierson's mounted assault deep into Confederate territory to divert opposing forces, Grant retaliated through strategic deception. When Lieutenant General John Pemberton received desperate Confederate appeals for reinforcements, he gave standing orders for Vicksburg's defense precedence over committing reserves. Union forces split apart after the river crossing to enclose Port Gibson's two entry points, forcing the numerically weaker Confederates to dismantle their walls. When Union patrols encountered disguised Confederate units close to Magnolia Church's deep thickets, hostilities broke out before daylight on May 1st. The consequences of Pemberton's delayed reinforcement approval were disastrous. Despite fierce fight, Confederate units that were overextended suffered terrible losses. According to Bowen's after-action report, troops did a great job, but the numerical difference was too great. The withdrawal that followed left hundreds of prisoners stranded and led to the evacuation of Fort Coburn, ceding control of the Grand Gulf's perimeter to the Union. Vicksburg's defensive system was penetrated by the seizure of Port Gibson, turning Grant's previous Grand Gulf defeat into a strategic advantage through two territory wins. Grant's staged campaign architecture was validated by this crucial victory, which created an unimpeded approach vector into Vicksburg. Grant understood that the preemptive suppression of enemy reinforcement capability was necessary for the capture of Vicksburg. After the Port Gibson victory, he prioritized interdicting the supply networks that supported the fortress instead of directly confronting Vicksburg. Before starting the latter stages of the attack preparations, his eastern flanking strategy required cutting off Confederate supply lines. The Southern Railroad in Mississippi became the main focus of the campaign. General Joseph E. Johnston arrived in Jackson, with troops meant for the garrison at Vicksburg, according to operational intelligence. Grant recognized Johnston's detachment as the primary threat that needed to be eliminated right away. When Johnston, mistakenly thinking that Vicksburg was undefended, deliberately redeployed to Canton, leaving Jackson with only a tiny garrison, strategic fate benefited Union forces. Confederate resource use was prevented by Grant's methodical destruction of military infrastructure during his takeover of the state capital on May 14th. After deciphering Johnston's operational directive, Union intelligence officers directed Pemberton to approach Clinton. Grant accelerated moves to avoid Confederate convergence, even though he knew Johnston's true position. According to historical study, Johnston's strategy was to sacrifice Vicksburg in order to lure Union soldiers into advantageous terrain for a focused counteroffensive. Pemberton, on the other hand, was still dedicated to Vicksburg's static defense and awaited reinforcement before the Union invaded. In the end, both Confederate leaders made a mistake. Vicksburg was left alone as Johnston's enticement plan failed to succeed and Pemberton's promised reinforcements never showed up. Confederate defenders decided their position was untenable after a 47-day siege. Garrison commanders reluctantly agreed to discuss terms of capitulation because there was little chance of assistance and hunger was impending. They turned down Grant's original demand for complete surrender despite their perilous situation. The Union commander changed his conditions and suggested that Vicksburg's staunch defenders be granted parole. This compromise was motivated by pragmatism. While parole allowed Confederate men to return home under oath to refrain from fighting, until Union control over Vicksburg was established, Grant's logistical limitations prevented him from maintaining prisoners. Confederate leadership, facing impending disintegration, agreed to the updated terms on July 4, 1863. The Confederacy was geographically divided as a result of this crucial surrender, which gave the Union total control over the Mississippi River. The Confederate decline was expedited by the strategic victory, which led to the Union's victory at the end of the Civil War 2 years later. Was Grant the most obstinate gambler in American military history, or was he a genius? Consider it. He smirked as he stared down two Confederate armies, starved his supply lines, and drowned his own canals. Nevertheless, West Point continues to teach his Vicksburg playbook 161 years later. Why? Because it wasn't just a war that Grant won. He turned chaos into a weapon. Here's the terrifying twist, though. Will the Union win the war if Vicksburg doesn't fall? Not only did Lincoln's key open the Mississippi, several weeks prior to Gettysburg, it destroyed Confederate morale. We almost forget, though, that Grant had the option to back off. He was urged to do so by his own generals. What made him double down then? Was it conceit or a calculated secret that Sherman didn't even notice? It's your turn. Share your best opinion below. Did Grant simply outsmart the Confederates, or did he change the rules of war? And ask yourself, if you're still not convinced, would a contemporary general be able to defeat Vicksburg today? Warning: Sherman's march is about to begin in the comments.